Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. First of all, I have to give you my profound apologies for last week. I was poorly. I'm not quite sure where the bug I got came from, but I strongly suspect that because the previous weekend I'd done air trips accumulating to 3,000 miles over 3 days, and also I shared these journeys, which came to about six and a half hours in total flying time, with 300 strangers on each occasion, there and back. It is possible that someday one of those 600 people might have had some sort of major issue which they passed on, not obviously in any sort of malicious sense, but simply because of the inadequacies of filtering systems in a typical carrier. So you have to live with these things, I'm afraid, if you choose to be out and about. But the reason for my trip was a rather sad one. It was to attend the service for my brother-in-law who died, and it was a somewhat bittersweet occasion. The chance to meet family and friends after a long time, at the same time sharing the memories and thoughts of a fine man who passed. But it's part of life's rich pageant, I think, as they sometimes say. So my apologies for missing last week. Let me also add, as I do most weeks, that it's been a great day for British democracy. Despite kowtowing and grovelling to the President of the United States, it looks like the British Prime Minister has secured no better deal than if he'd stood on his principles and said, up with this we will not put. Sanctions are coming Britain's way, despite the imprecations of Peter Mandelson, who is now our man in Washington, D.C., and I assume they will be roundly ignored by the administration there, who have their own problems by the looks of it, even though they're polling quite well in Florida amongst people of a certain age. Nonetheless, in other states like Wisconsin, which is red, as they say in the States, red meaning Trump, Republican, the non-Republican justice was elected to the state Supreme Courts, which also has an impact on the way the Constitution operates in the United States. The various Supreme Courts, and particularly the main Supreme Court, act as a counterbalance, or are intended by the Founding Fathers to have had that purpose, a counterbalance to the executive, i.e. the presidency, and the two houses, which is striking because one of the major issues which cropped up when the Founding Fathers were thinking about the Constitution was someone has suggested that they should call George Washington not president but king, and that was roundly abused from all quarters. And they said, we just got rid of a king, we will never have a king again. So you can imagine how Americans felt when Donald Trump says, I wish to be king. I hope he had his tongue in cheek when he made that remark. Yes, it was a good result in Wisconsin, and I suspect things may be changing. We hear rumours that Elon Musk has been asked to take a back seat. That will be quite difficult because Elon Musk has some trouble understanding simple language. For example, I saw him being interviewed on television, I think last night, in which he was asked, you are running DOGE, which is the Department of Government Efficiency, and at the same time, you're one of its major suppliers. Isn't that a conflict of interest? I think the answer to that question was a simple yes, but he contrived to answer it the following way. He said, look, the DOG work that I do is more transparent than anyone else has ever done, and therefore on that basis, we should continue with things. He didn't, of course, address the point about conflict of interest, where it seems to be that he's marking his own report card, which is bad enough in academic circles, but it's even worse if you're actually you're actually providing the government with resources, and you determine if these are being satisfactorily delivered, and you also agree upon the cost of those services. I mean, I couldn't think of a more blatant conflict of interest. Anyway, enough of all that. Let's move on to our great guest tonight. We have Professor Alf Baird with us, and we'll be talking about a variety of things, his books, and also his thoughts on the union between England and Scotland. And I think you'll find, some of you will find it surprising about the nature of that relationship, how it began and how it's developed since then, and what these ramifications have for the constitution of the UK, but also for the way forward for Scotland. So without any further ado, I would ask you all to welcome Professor Alf Baird. Alf, how are you?
I'm very well, John. Good evening.
Where are you joining us from tonight?
The Orkney Islands.
Oh, lovely. And how's the weather with you just now?
It's beautiful today. It's almost like the Caribbean.
Oh my God. I never thought I'd hear these two expressions in the same sentence. Orkney Islands and the Caribbean. That's a first, a broadcasting first, Al.
Yeah. We had the first cruise ship visit of the season today.
Oh my. What sort of impact does that make on the community?
Oh, it's a big impact. There's a lot of employment related to it. There's a lot of incomes related to it. The cruise visitors do a lot of shopping. They visit all the tourist sites. But there is, of course, a lot of pressure on the environment as well, the sites. But that's well managed here. The community have a long history of managing things really well. In fact, in July they're hosting the island games for all the islands in Europe and further afield. Here, and there'll be over 2,000 athletes. So Orkney always does well with whatever it does.
So that's amazing. It's amazing. Yeah. Do you get involved in any of this stuff?
Well, I do a bit swimming, but not competitive. I used to play snooker competitively, but that's not part of the games.
Oh, now tell me, do you go swimming in the ocean there?
No, just
in the pool. I should think not.
There's too many jellyfish nearby here, or what the Welsh call the wibbly wobblies.
Well, I'll tell you what, going into an ocean at that temperature will give me the wibbly wobblies, I can tell you.
Yeah, it's a bit Baltic, but there we go.
Actually, truth be told, I watched a movie about Orkney just the other night there, just been released.
Oh, The Outrun.
Yeah, The Outrun.
Yes.
Do you recommend it?
Oh yes, it's a very good film. It's got great scenes and everything about Orkney. It's not necessarily about Orcadians, though. It's about people who came here and lived here, but also have other issues in their life, and it goes back and forward to London, as you know, and it's about other things to do with addiction and mental health. Yeah. But it's very interesting. It has a lot of had a lot of interest here in Orkney.
Really? I thought it was awfully well done.
Yes,
I have to say. I mean, I don't know. I've never been to Orkney, but my sense of it was they captured some of the atmosphere.
Yeah, well, Orkney has a fantastic history and archaeological record as well, going back to Neolithic period, and then the Pictish period, and then the Viking period, and then back to the Scot-Pictish period. So it's and also the Romans apparently dropped in for a little while on a round Britain cruise after the Battle of Mons Graupus. So
really.
But then the stones here, the standing stones, go back, I think, 5,000 years. Some of the sites go back, and it's got the oldest housing scheme in Europe, probably at Scarab Brae.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, so lots to see, and lots of things happened here in thousands of years ago.
Yeah, isn't it amazing? Do you think the climate was very different then?
Well, it went through periods of climatic change, including a deep freeze, I think, around about the later Middle Ages, which also affected Iceland, and volcanic eruptions that affected a lot of people. But in general, I think the climate here is actually very settled, if you like, in the sense that it's quite mild because of the Gulf Stream and the prevailing westerlies. It is stormy though. You do get about 30 odd gales a year. So, you need to batten down the hatches and tie down the car, the car and the sheep. But apart from that, it's a fine place to live. The weather comes and goes usually very rapidly, so you get 3 or 4 seasons in a day sometimes.
Yeah. Are you affected? We've interviewed people from the islands before, mainly in the Hebrides, who've been concerned about the fact that it's very difficult for young people to stay.
Yes, well, here there's been I would say there's been a very significant in-migration of people buying the available properties. So the prices are bid very, very high. The market here is probably the highest prices you'll see outside Edinburgh, and probably that's
Really?
the case. And so the prices are pretty high for housing. So young people can't get on the housing market, and the councils don't have enough money, and the housing association to build housing stock. So there's a real serious problem there, and I think that goes back to some of the issues I cover in the book that we might discuss is to do with migration and demographics in general, which have a big impact on the independence prospect.
Yeah, you mentioned your book. Let's talk about your book. Why did you write it?
Well, the book Dunhodden I wrote it. I was active during the independence referendum, and before it, a couple of years before it, in the Academics for Yes group, publishing articles about why Scotland should be independent and what benefits there might be from that. And I wasn't, after the referendum or around then, I wasn't convinced that the people would really fully understand what independence meant. So because I'm a researcher, I decided to research as much of the literature as I could. It's a research textbook, basically. It looks at theory on independence within Scotland and further afield, and what we can learn from that, and also looks into what's known as post-colonial theory. That's the writers who have written about colonialism as it's happened before, during colonialism and after colonialism. It's called post-colonial theory. So from this, I was able to develop a theoretical framework, which is what I was able to do in my other research projects going back a number of years, and from what we call grounded theory method, which is using existing theories and information to develop a new theory. And I developed a theoretical framework, which I think Kevin might show now on the theoretical framework. There's 9 dimensions there to independence. These are what I call determinants of independence: culture, language, demographics, colonialism, nationalism, institutions, constitution, ethnicity, and self-determination. The 9 determinants. So what it basically demonstrates is that independence is a very multifaceted kind of situation, requiring analysis of each of these dimensions, careful analysis to explain the phenomenon of independence, and really what it is, which I found it was decolonization. And if you look at the UN information on independence, it's all about decolonization. So you have to think about independence in a slightly different way. A lot of these issues were never addressed during the referendum campaign. Everybody focused on what the mainstream media was focusing on as well, was pensions, defense, currency, economics, these kind of things. But what I found is that some of the key aspects here were not considered. And it actually came out in post-referendum research Edinburgh University did, which showed that a lot of the vote was to do with belonging and sense of identity. In effect, how Scottish do you feel and how British do you feel? But how these senses of belonging are determined, you need to then embrace some of these behavioural and psychological issues, remembering also that colonialism is based on psychology. It's not necessarily based on what you think is best for your country. It's based on your mindset in that sense. You know, the first two dimensions there, culture and language, very important, because you won't get an independence movement without national consciousness. And Scottish national consciousness comes from these 2 dimensions, our culture and our language, and particularly the Scots language. because most Scots speak the Scots language. We didn't ken it. It's a great language. It's a broad language, but in colonial terms, we're deprived of it. We don't learn it. We didn't learn it, and it's made invalid. And that is one of the key colonial procedures imperial powers adopt and implement to any colonized power. You know, I mean, I think India was the first colony that English studies was imposed on, even before Scots.
Yeah, well, maybe some places in the Caribbean too. I noticed there's no reference to economics there. Is that a subset?
It comes in completely under the colonialism banner, because colonialism is fundamentally, first and foremost, about economic exploitation. And that's the objective of colonialism. It's done also politically and culturally, but its fundamental objective is economic exploitation. So the reason why Scotland is held so closely by Westminster is it's a very, very valuable resource in many different ways, and that is where the economics come in. It's also partly to do with institutions as well. And the institutions within a colonial society, as I would argue is that Scotland is, tend to adopt the values of the colonial power. So it's the values that are very important here, and that's linked also to culture. So the cultural values are very important. And here a good example is, of course, the privatization ethos of the English government, as I would say, the England as Britain government, Westminster. Its focus is very much on privatization and private ownership, private profit. And that's what all the privatization policies were about, which is at odds with Scotland's traditional cultures and concepts, and even today, the value of an egalitarian society and the common good, the focus on the common good, which is also embodied in the Claim of Right, which is a condition of the Treaty of Union, the Claim of Right Act 1689. So Scotland's culture and traditions and values are fundamentally different from what we've had imposed these last 300 years, particularly the last 50 years with these efforts to fully privatize public utilities. And I'm thinking most of my research was on seaports, and the UK government went furthest of any country in the world really to privatize seaports, the land, the operations, as well as the regulatory powers. And the same with airports and other utilities to some extent adopt a kind of self-regulatory process. And they've all went to eventually become owned by offshore equity funds. So Scotland is really just a big asset play of offshore equity funds. So Scotland, in a sense, the land, the resources have all been disposed of, irrespective of what the Scots wanted. We never really voted for Thatcherism, but by God, we got it. And plus we got the economic collapse as well. We got the deindustrialization just a few years before peak global demand for steel, as you all know, and all our industries were shut down. In addition to that, we generate an enormous amount of energy now, but we get no royalties for it. And we have paradoxically the highest electricity prices, certainly amongst all the oil-rich countries of the world, but probably we have the highest electricity prices in the world now, as far as I can see, 4 times higher than Norway. And that's why we can't compete industrially.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, some people would push back against your claim that Scotland is a colony. They would say, well, hold on a second, colonies are not represented at the main parliament. That's it. I mean, Canada was a colony, India was a colony, South Africa was a colony, but they didn't have representation at Westminster. Scotland does.
Yes, that's right. Even Malta was offered 1 seat at Westminster, perhaps 2, but refused it and became independent. But Ireland, of course, had many seats in Westminster. But previous UN investigations have suggested that Ireland was colonised. So, and Ireland became independent, the Republic, at least the rest subject to partition, which is the usual UK imperial policy of exit of colonies, and something Scotland has to be concerned about as well. So, yeah, I think but of course, at the time of union, which was a bit of a hoax, it was even admitted by commentators at the time that the entry of 40 odd Scots on the seats at Westminster would have no effect, because they have no veto. There's no Scottish veto on English laws. It's basically imposition of English laws, and that's what happened with Wales's annexation, and also to a large degree Ireland. So that's why the Treaty of Union, treaties are, of course, in colonialism, pretty much every colonized people was handed a worthless treaty. It all looked nice and it was all presented to them by very well-spoken gentlemen usually, but it was immediately violated and never really implemented to any great extent. And that's the same with Scotland. Scotland's had numerous violations of the treaty. The treaty violations continue, but in a sense, it's never been implemented. And that's what the findings of Salvo and Sarah Salyers is, that the treaty was never implemented because it was supposed to be a united kingdom and one crown, but we're left with two crowns still.
There's a point here that you make, and I'm attributing it to you, Alf, and if it wasn't you, correct me, please. It says, the UK Parliament therefore remains subject to the superior, in brackets, i.e. sovereign, close brackets, power of the treaty's signatory parties, that is, the sovereign kingdoms of Scotland and England, either of whom may permanently withdraw their representatives from the UK Parliament, following which the Union Act would be repealed.
Well, that's the general international law relating to treaties. Any treaty partner signatory has the power to withdraw from it. When a treaty is no longer in your nation's interest, it should be ended. And that is normal international rules and reasoning behind treaty making. So the reason Scotland has not done that is the question. Why has it not withdrawn from the treaty that's no longer, was never really in Scotland's interest anyway? And it was a corrupt treaty, as we know, to begin with. It was not required by the people. The people opposed it, and it was subject to extensive bribery and coercion. So the threat of military force was there as well. So there's coercion and bribery involved. So I would say to anybody that wants to suggest that the treaty should be upheld, they need to think about its origins, first of all, which was criminal. So there is that respect. But in a sense, a signatory party to a treaty must have the right to withdraw from it. That's under international law. That the Scottish representatives have not done so is a matter they really need to address. But well, I think,
they saw. I mean, I saw a clip featuring Angus Robertson, who was asked this sort of question recently, and his answer was, "Well, there's only one way to do this, and that is to appeal to the British state, i.e., that the proper route would be through some sort of referendum." Which resulted, should the referendum be successful, in a Scotland Independence Act passed by the Westminster Parliament, and that's I think that's called his preferred route.
Well, I think that's his preferred option. But the reality is, in the situation Scotland finds itself in, once you elect majorities of nationalists, they're expected to do the necessary. That is to withdraw and to enter into treaties that they feel are positive, and to leave treaties that they feel are negative. So before the devolution, of course, whenever there was a nationalist majority envisaged, even the Tories admitted that was sufficient for Scotland to be independent and to negotiate its way out of the Union. So Mrs. Thatcher agreed that, Norman Tebbit said that in the House, numerous others said it as well. And then all of a sudden, when we start getting majorities of SNP MPs in Westminster, somebody somewhere changes the hurdles. But essentially in colonialism, as Albert Memmi, the great colonial theorist, said, the colonizer will always exiting the independence seem impossible for the colonized. They will always make it seem impossible, and that's exactly what the unionists have done since the union began. They've said it's impossible. But essentially, it's up to nationalist representatives when they're elected, and a nationalist majority in a colony is usually de facto independence. In any other colony, when you get a nationalist majority elected, that is and standing on an independence ticket, that is normally.
Isn't this the nub of it that we're getting to now, Alf? Is that people don't know what an SNP representative stands for.
Yeah. Well, that's to say before.
Here. I mean, on the one hand, they're elected on the basis that they support independence. However, in the next breath, they're saying we have to go down to Westminster to represent our constituents. Now, that seems to be an acceptance that they're not really nationalist, they're something in between. Until somebody comes along and helps them to resolve that, they plan to opt for a devolved arrangement, even though they're carrying a badge that says I'm a nationalist. They're a nationalist with a very small n, perhaps. And eventually what happens is an accommodation is arrived at, where these people are allowed to say what they want in the floor of the House. But again, it seems to me it's very difficult when your objectives are split.
Yeah, well, I have to say post-colonial theory is quite clear on what happens with a dominant national party in which the people put their faith. And what happens is basically what we see. So we have a dominant national party, and it essentially takes its foot off the gas once it's elected. It does actually rely on the ultimate, the generosity of the imperial power to open the door to liberation, which is a forlorn hope and a waste of time largely. But what happens?
Isn't that forlorn hope created by this schizoid approach, which is that I accept I'm elected to represent my constituents, which means I have to compromise, but at the same time I'm carrying a badge called nationalist, which means I don't compromise. How do you resolve that?
Well, in a sense, they're no longer nationalists, are they? Because a nationalist in a state of colonialism. Remember, colonialism is regarded as a scourge, a form of punishment on a people. Yeah. That's how the UN define it. So you're a non-self-governing territory. All your assets are taken out at will by the imperial power, and your culture is obliterated and destroyed, and your people are cast to all the far corners of the world and largely replaced, as what happened in Scotland to some extent. So we have that situation. The role of the nationalist representatives is to liberate the people. My findings in my research tell me that colonialism, to end it, you have to decolonize. And that's what the UN describe as independence. And most countries that have become independent have done it through the decolonization process of the United Nations.
But
that's the laws.
Isn't it, my point is, isn't it much easier if you don't serve in the, as you would put it, the colonial parliament? I mean, the reason it's perhaps a lot easier for Malta and South Africa and India
Ireland, yeah.
They're not, well, no, Ireland is not that, but they weren't sending representatives to Westminster. There wasn't that conflict of interest. Now we've had some people write in and say, well, if you just withdraw your representatives from Westminster, then you would be labelled as rebels, and it would achieve nothing, and the unionists would be cock-a-hoop.
Well, that's for some people to say, but nationalists have to if the nationalists seeking to make their country independent, they have to step up to the plate at the end of the day. What we find in post-colonial theory is it tells us the national party becomes petrified. It becomes immobilized. It suffers from that petrifaction. It lacks innovation. It seeks an accommodation with the colonial power. it seeks to, it takes the people up, the movement up a blind alley then. And that's what leads to the rupture in the movement. We have a ruptured independence movement. We have had, over the last few years, the National Party, SNP, has lost more than half of its members now. Why has that happened? It's because we have this rupture. We've had new parties then created. That's part of the model, the decolonization template. So we see what that happens here. The elite in the National Party, they become part of the racket, if you like. In some places, they've actually behaved like a gang, and they've imposed. They've attacked even radicals. They've used the state, the forces of the state, to attack radicals.
Forgive me, I'm still slightly confused here, Alf, because I think this argument would carry more weight if, for example, Alex Salmond had said, let's withdraw our representatives from Westminster. But he didn't. He went along with all of this stuff.
Yeah.
In fact, he served in both places, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
well, yeah.
How much more subservient can you be than that?
Yeah.
I'm saying that with some degree of concern because, you know, I knew Alec, I admired Alec, but it seems to me there's a basic contradiction there.
I'll tell you what I found in my research is that what the post-colonial theorists tell you is the National Party elite never undertake a reasoned study of colonial society. So they don't really understand how grim the situation really is, especially for the most impoverished people in the country. We're sitting here in a country that's very rich, but has about half the people living in are close to poverty, and with a GDP the lowest in Northwest Europe, and the highest electricity prices in Northwest Europe, if not the world. So we're in a hellish position for most people. But what you find is the political elite join in the racket, as it were, become part of the system. They seek that accommodation with colonialism. And that's what the post-colonial model tells you happened in many places around the world. And Scotland, remember, has a very Anglophone bourgeoisie. It has, and the bourgeoisie in post-colonial theory come in for particular criticism because the bourgeoisie are the most pampered element, and the most pampered group in the colonial society. And they have a lot going for them. But that's part and parcel of the whole thing. We have quite a significant bourgeoisie. We also have a large public sector with about a third of the jobs in Scotland public sector related, and probably half the wages go in the public sector. And most of the Holyrood budget is wages. And so what the colonial administration does is it's pumping out that money to keep the system going. It's, in a sense, it's the wages of colonialism. But what we don't know, and what I've calculated and others have tried to calculate, is what the cost of colonialism really is. And I've estimated, based on GDP analysis per capita, compared with other countries with a lot less resources than us, that our leakage is about 150 billion a year. So the cost of colonialism...
150 billion?
150 billion a year. If you say assumed our GDP per capita should be equivalent to Denmark, for example, it's only $60,000, $70,000 a year. We're 40,000. Norway and Ireland over 100,000. Switzerland over 100. So if we were reasonably to say that our GDP per capita should be about $65,000, $70,000, we're losing 150 billion a year, and that's a lot of money.
That's an enormous amount of money.
It's a lot of money. But you can think about
I'm
it.
absolutely convinced of this, because it just sounds extraordinary to me.
Well, why is Denmark's GDP so much higher? It has no resources compared to Scotland.
Well, it's got Greenland.
But it pays to keep Greenland. It doesn't get any money out of it. But and I've been to Nuuk. It's a very interesting place. But yeah, that's the cost of colonialism. Broadly, also in post-colonial theory, the cost of the cost of colonialism is equivalent to the extent of poverty and deprivation as well that the people face.
Do you agree with the concept as is presently underway about going to the UN and saying to the UN, we're a colony, and we would appeal to the UN to help us do something about that. Is that something you support?
Well, that was the findings in my book, which suggested that if the political process fails, as it's done, and we have successive independence mandates, 6 mandates for referendums now, 3 at Holyrood, 3 at Westminster, mandates in favour of another referendum on independence, all blocked by the imperial power, then you don't have any other option but to use international law.
Well, hold on a second. Some people would say, yeah, you've got lots of options. I mean, Gandhi was told he had no options. He chose civil disobedience.
Yes.
What he did was to say to the imperial parliament, of course you can continue ignoring us, but it's going to cost you a bunch.
Yes, but what we find with Holyrood, of course, it's not interested in civil disobedience.
Yes,
I think what we have to also remember is, although we have nationalist politicians there, or nominally nationalist, as Peter Bell calls them, we have a civil service that's managed from Whitehall.
Yeah.
Our civil service is not nationalist. We have a government that says it's nationalist. Well, it actually doesn't want to be nationalist anymore, because the SNP over the last few years have come to regard the term nationalism as not something they would want to necessarily associate with. But nationalism is, in self-determination sense, is about liberation of the people, about independence, about decolonization. It's not transnational nationalism, which is what the British Union imposes and what other regimes have done. So yeah, it's about understanding our situation a bit better. So the institutions loom large in this, and that's one of the determinants of independence. You might have a nationalist sitting in Holyrood, but your civil service and your governance throughout the Scotland is not nationalist. It's anything but.
I mean, it is an interesting point. I mean, I've always been uncomfortable with the idea that the head of the civil service in Edinburgh reports to somebody in London who does not necessarily regard that reporting line as terribly senior. They would look at the Department of Health, they would look at Defence and regard them as senior appointments, but not necessarily the person sitting in the top civil service job.
Well, there was a famous study, not well publicised, by Professor Michael Hechter on the internal colonial model of the UK. And he regarded Scotland's meritocracy as a cultural, what he called a cultural division of labour. So all the top jobs are advertised in the London press, the civil service and everything send their best people up to manage the Celtic periphery. So that's what we've had. We've had that for over a century. You know, in late Victorian times, there was only over 30,000 people in Edinburgh living in Edinburgh from England, and so all the institutions. I did an analysis of universities, which I spent a large part of my career in, and I found that in quite a few of certainly the ancient ones, it was only about 10% of the academics were Scottish. Which would be a scandal in Norway, you know, if you or Denmark, if you said that 90% of the academics in Denmark were German, you know, you would think they were still under a certain regime that controlled them during the Second War. But that's another matter.
Let me put another argument to you that some people have raised with me, and they've said, well, but we don't quite understand what's happening about going to United Nations. It may work out, it may not. We'd rather prefer to do it through the British state. We don't think the Scottish government's been nearly assertive enough, but maybe there's a bit change in attitude and they might find a backbone and become slightly more nationalist. But then they say, but of course, this is all wrong. The timing is terrible because we've got a US president who is capricious, mean-minded, and liable to go off at a tangent. You know, this is the wrong time to be making these assertions, going to United Nations, stirring things up. Surely we should keep our heads down and wait until this Trump typhoon tornado dissipates itself. And then once international relations are back to some form of normality, then that would be the time to make these representations. What do you say to that?
Well, the NGOs in Geneva say that what we're doing is entirely lawful and required under under the resolutions that the UN have made. So we have, first of all, a denial of self-determination. That's a repeated denial. There's 6 mandates that I can see that where the SNP campaigned for a referendum on independence, all been denied. We still have colonial exploitation, and that's one of the fundamental issues the UN will look at. We have this, looking at even renewables coming up, 60 billion worth of renewables by 2030, probably 100 billion worth not long after. It's going to dwarf oil and gas value. That's one of the reasons why Scotland is held tight. We get no royalties from this. You look at you looked at aghast when I said we're worth 150 billion a year to all those offshore equity funds and others. That are basically screwing Scotland, but that's the reality. And with renewables is a classic example, a big example. We also have the historic misrepresentation of Scotland. Back in 1960, the UK was asked what is at the height of decolonizations that the UN was dealing with post World War II. What is Scotland's position? And Scotland's position was they were told was one of an equal or a voluntary partner in a union, but Scots weren't really asked that at the time. We could have decolonised even then. So there's all these different things. We have had democratic violations in the sense of the referendum that's been mandated has not been held. Scotland has a right also to self-determination. That's an inalienable right. Nobody else has the right to tell us we can't have a referendum on self-determination or anything else. Even the UK Supreme Court, which itself is another violation of the treaty. So all these things are unlawful internationally and go against what the UK signed up to, these UN resolutions on self-determination. So it's the UK government that's playing fast and loose with UK international with international laws and resolutions that the UN abide by.
Interesting. I mean, so your view is that it doesn't really matter what's happening in the States, elsewhere, tariffs or whatever, that this is a line that ought to be pursued. And I mean, would you expect, I'm not saying anticipate, but would you expect that that there will be a positive reception to from the UN, or do you feel that if whatever the UN decides, that it will attract negative publicity and people will say, well, why haven't you kept things here at home? You've gone to involve people elsewhere in New York, and where do we go from here now?
Well, I think it will be of high interest to the UN. Remember also there's a lot of the non-self-governing territories that remain to be decolonised are administered by the UK. And there's also another non-self-governing territory, the Falklands or Malvinas, that's a matter of long-standing conflict with the Argentinians. So the other aspect here, of course, we're going back to the formation of the UN, which was, the UK treaty was never implemented. It was never implemented. England's government never changed. Scotland's parliament was abolished, but England's parliament was not. England's parliament continued, just with the addition of a few Scots, and England's crown has continued, but Scotland's crown has been in a kind of perpetual limbo ever since. So there's a whole range of different issues here that could be interesting or should be interesting to constitutional minded people, but essentially the avenues there. I think what also it will create is an interest and awareness of people in Scotland that the situation here is not all it seems. It's all it's presented by the mainstream media as a union, a one nation Britain, as it were. And of course, in colonial theory, and the idea of Britishness is a bit of a cultural illusion. And that goes back to the cultural aspects of colonialism. Colonialism is about making a people change their identity. And that's been attempted in a significant way with Scots to reduce their sense of belonging to their Scottish culture and identity, and to make themselves feel more British. So essentially, all these aspects of colonialism have to be dealt with. But in post-colonial theory, the fight for independence is a fight for a national culture, essentially. It's not about necessarily riches or about how we deal with currency or how we deal with the EU or defence. It's about reclaiming national culture and self-recovery of that culture and getting away from the cringe.
Yeah, I thought that was significant in the 2014 referendum. I mean, I had lots of reservations about the way that was done from a nationalist perspective. I've talked before on this program about the fact that we went into that like a one-club golfer. We weren't prepared to say very many negative things about the union, and therefore we left that whole area wide open to the Better Together campaign to fill it full of all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, well, one of the aspects they homed in on was trade and global trade. Global trade is something I've been studying for a long time. It was subject to my PhD as well, and shipping. And what I found was that pretty much all the countries that decolonized from the UK, the first thing they did was to reorientate their trade away from the UK. What we had in the referendum campaign was the UK side, the unionist side, saying, well, Scotland's trade is dependent on England. But that's what colonialism does. It makes you dependent. It makes a place. So we're a dependency in that sense, but it's not a good one because they take out our trade cheap and they sell us everything back dear. And that's what the colonial relationship is.
That's the very point I tried to make to them. I said, you have to tell people the negative impact of the present system. Yeah. And they said, no, we leave that to them. We want to be unremittingly positive. And I felt that was just a terrible mistake. Yeah. Because what clinched things in the end, it seems to me, was the third offer. I mean, the deal that was struck was it was either yes or no. And then at the 11th hour, all of a sudden there was a middle position offered, which should have been disallowed, in my opinion. Yeah. Because people were now caught in two minds. They thought they could vote for independence, but choose a middle way to do it.
Well, one of the options that the UN has with countries that are non-self-governing territories seeking to decolonize is to ensure there's no external interference in any referendum.
Yeah.
And the problem with the 2014 referendum is it was full of external interference. It was absolutely, totally dominated by the British media, and that was one of the major problems. It was also the franchise. I've questioned in Doon Hodden, with the franchise is very irregular because it's Holyrood uses a local government franchise. It's the Scotland Act imposes a local government franchise on Holyrood, probably because Tony Blair and Donald Dewar and the rest of them thought it was just as he called it, a parish council. Yeah. So and because it's not a real parliament, it's not a sovereign parliament, they gave it a local government franchise. But you never use a local government franchise for national matters, for national elections or certainly not referendum on constitutional matters. And that is the norm globally. And wherever I looked in any other country, no other country would have adopted that franchise. And so we need a proper franchise. We need a proper mechanism for any future referendum, if there needs to be one. Because a referendum, bear in mind, is not a matter of law essential requirement for independence.
Yeah, well, I mean, your book. I mean, you're kind enough to send me a copy back in 2020. Your thoughts on this subject must have been around at the time of the referendum. Were you ever consulted by anyone? Did anyone ever come to you and say, "Well, you're a voice that is putting a particular perspective that might be helpful to us in the referendum"? Did you have any role in that?
No, I think there were many voices calling on the SNP, certainly after the referendum, to do something differently, and certainly after the election of the 56 Roaring Lions in 2015. I mean that to me was, there were people like myself calling then for withdrawal from Westminster, and basically that would have been a declaration of independence. But any majority of Scotland's MPs was always regarded, if they were nationalists, they were able to withdraw Scotland from the treaty. If anybody had a problem with that, they could always test it in a court. And personally, I would have loved to see that tested in the Scottish court, because which way would the judges go? Would they go with a majority of Scots holding up Scottish sovereignty, or would they go with a minority still running down to Westminster, holding Scotland's sovereignty in their hands? And that's the reality. Who holds the political sovereignty? Is it England's MPs? Is it a minority of Scots, or is it a majority of Scots? And it has to be a majority of Scots. Otherwise, the treaty isn't worth anything. And we know that the treaty isn't worth anything, but it would have been good to test it, because the treaty has been violated so much. It's really not worth the paper it was scribbled on. But there we go. We're in that situation. We have to realise that all colonised people, as I say, were handed worthless treaties. Scotland was handed a worthless treaty. We're just using England's Parliament to enact laws for Scotland. That's all we're doing. And they get to do that as long as Scots are represented there. As long as Scotland's MPs go down to Westminster, England's Parliament has a right to legislate for Scotland according to the treaty. But if they don't venture down there, that right is no longer valid.
Yeah, but as we said at the beginning, it would just take one unionist MP to go down, and that would be it.
I don't think that would be the case. It has to be a meaningful. I mean, it has to be a majority of members. Otherwise, people will see that it's just a fraud anyway.
So, I mean, what options? I mean, let's assume, you know, that the appeal to the UN falls on deaf ears, or more likely, it gets subsumed into the machinations of the UN, which is what happens to a lot of things like this. Where does that leave things then? Where does one go? I mean,
well, as I say, I think this is in liberation and processes like this. What's very important is the educational process that people go through. As I said earlier on, what I believed was that the people they hadn't been told what independence really meant.
Yeah.
And my finding is independence means decolonization. I don't know what the SNP think it means, the SNP members, the MPs and MSPs. I don't know. I don't think they really know what independence really means, because they don't know what nationalists are supposed to do. and the role of the nationalist politician in a colonial situation has always been the same. It's always been to liberate its people and liberate his nation. If he doesn't do that, and he's not able to do that, he should move out the way and let somebody else in that can do it. And that's why we've had the creation of new national parties. Independent Scotland Party is one party that's standing on a mandate. Well, it will abstain from. It will not take up its seats in Westminster if it's elected. And that was the same with Sinn Féin in Ireland. They were voted in Sinn Féin in the early 20s on the basis that they would not take their seats. Yeah. And that's what you have to do and be prepared to do.
Well, here's a question from Gregor McIntosh. He's asking, what do you think of the fact that we in Scotland contributed a large part to the British Empire, colonialising and oppressing nations all over the world?
Mm. Well, I think what I've found, and what also in Liberation and Salvo have found with their research, is that many colonial peoples were used as colonial armies, for example. Indians are a good example. There was Nigerians as well, Irish too. The Scots were no different. One of the reasons why the Union was forged was not only to remove more rebellious Scots from Scotland, and that happened big style in the 1700s, but was also to gain access to Scotland's resources. And one of its main resources was its people. And the Scots armies were used in 200 colonial engagements, 80 conflicts since the war. This is the issue about matters of war and peace. If you're independent, you've got power over war and peace. Matters of war and peace. If you're a colonial society like we are, you're ruled over by another set of values that will take you into war. And Scotland's been drawn into 80 conflicts since the end of World War II. 80 conflicts that Ireland has avoided through its independence. We've got another potential one at the moment where London seems to think that going into Ukraine with military stuff and assets and people is a great idea. I would venture to suggest that most Scots would say that's not a good idea. And we would not do that had we been independent. So on matters of war and peace, it's very important that we do our own thing. But when you're a colonial society, you're sent to the front. You're sent to the, and Scots were always sent to the very front.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue with any of that, but I would also say that a number of Scots were involved willingly in exploitation of other countries.
Yeah,
there's no question about that. I mean,
I think what we're comparing
look at what happened in China.
Yeah,
you know, I mean, you know, we're talking about a very serious drug running into China, which was masterminded by a whole number of Scots. They didn't do that because somebody held their arm up their back. They did it because they wanted to get hold of some cash.
Going back to post-colonial theory, what it tells us also is that colonialism is also a joint venture with native elites.
Yeah.
So the Scottish native elites loved it. They were into it in a big way. But just the same as Indian native elites, Irish native elites, and other countries, Kenyan native elites, Malaysian native elites, they were all part of the system. They become part of the system. The same with the French system in Africa. It always had native elites, tribal leaders, all the rest of it were paid off. So it's nothing unusual. Of course, you have a native elites, the Scots native elite that's going into that in a big way. And of course, by the 1700s, 1800s, the Scottish native elite was largely Anglophone. You know, it has changed its values in a significant way. And that started, of course, in 1603 with the Union of the Crowns, the movement of the Scottish court down to London and all the rest of it, and the English education of Scottish aristocrat children. So it's once that value system becomes dominant in the elite class, that's part and parcel of colonialism. It's nothing unusual. But we have classical colonialism, which was to do with slavery and plantations in the Caribbean and so on. But we have post-colonial theory, which takes us to the modern times and the UN situation and the UN decolonization program. And the UN, let's remember, was set up to reduce the powers of the great imperial powers and to increase decolonization. That's what the UN was created for, largely, is to make a peaceful world and a trading world. A peaceful world, a trading world, and to decolonize and to stop this colonial oppression. So we have that situation now where we still have this situation that we have to address. The other thing about colonialism is if it's allowed to continue, the people and nation perish. And Scotland is in the process of perishing. We just need to look at the birth rate we have and our migration, our demographics. We can see that. But also in an underdeveloped sense, the colony is always underdeveloped. Its people are underdeveloped. It's lacking in opportunities. It's lacking in earnings and wealth, all the rest of it. But lacking in opportunities is the main one. And that's what caused a lot of the out-migration of Scots. Yeah. Lacking in opportunities in their own land, as most of us have got family that had to emigrate.
Yeah.
And that's
you're speaking to one of them. Yeah. Look, we've only got a few seconds left, Al. This has been great. I appreciate it. Any last concluding thoughts you would like to leave to our listeners and watchers and audience?
Yeah, I think really a call for unity amongst everybody focused on independence. Everybody to think about unity, because unity is one of the ways the only way we can overcome this burden that we face, the lack of opportunities for our people, and the lack of resources, access to their own resources. This is potentially a very wealthy country, but also one with great opportunities it should have for its own people, and to stop the oppression. Dún Hodden, I should say, is the Scots term for oppressed. And one of the things I think the great things the Scottish government could do is to introduce Scots language teaching into the schools, because language is central to our identity, a central part of it. And they're introducing Gaelic, which is fine for Gaelic speakers, but most of us are Scots speakers. Most of us have got a good Scots tongue in our head. And a lot of us know, but the Scots language, that's a human right as well. And it's a human right to learn your language, and that's the pride. So unity and culture and language, very central.
Your point is well made, Alf. Thank you very much for that. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the show as much as I have, folks, because Alf has been a great guest. In fact, I suspect we've only touched upon a fraction of what you had to say tonight. We've only got an hour, so we did what we could. Thank you for that. And I would say to everyone, I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have talking with Alf. A big thank you to Alf. And can I just mention that next week, which is show 198, we'll have Dr. Mark McNaught joining us, talking about issues similar to what we're talking about tonight. Alf, thank you again. Good night to everyone. Stay safe, take care, look after each other. See you next week, 7 o'clock. Good night.